Thank you so much. So I'm going to be talking today about some work that under the hood is quite mathematical. But for me, what's really exciting is the policy implications layer, where for me, this is the work that's brought me closest to sort of extremely important global issues. So to get started, I have a background studying large-scale social networks. And in this work, I'm going to talk about some research that involves sort of much smaller networks. So the following is a social network of individuals in a village in Honduras. So this is a photo from that village. This is in a village outside Honduras in Honduras. And this is fieldwork run by a collaborator, Nicholas Christakis, out of the Yale Human Nature Lab. And the question that he's been posing in fieldwork, and a bunch of people who've been doing a very ambitious fieldwork over the last few years have been posing, is sort of this classic question of sort of applied social psychology, marketing, et cetera, which is if you were, let's say, to begin with, that you were able to observe this social network. If you walked into this village and you had this sort of bird's eye view of the social network, who should you seed an intervention at? You're trying to increase the adoption of a water purification system. You're trying to increase adoption of multivitamins. Those are actually the two interventions that they were studying in this case. And there's lots of sort of elegant theories, most of which point to somehow seeding the intervention at the more connected individuals. If you can get the more connected individuals to use the product or whatever, you can then sort of see positive spillovers as you're getting additional individuals to adopt your product. And so there's been, this is a classic problem for marketing that has become very of high interest within specifically development economics over the last 5 to 10 years. So the important question here is basically, when we look at a village like this, we are looking to select a fixed set of individuals, maybe 2 or 3. And then we're looking at sort of the village level outcome. So the comparative question that we're looking at is sort of if we go into a village like this and we go for sort of the red nodes, which would be 2 very central individuals, we would maybe expect to see a certain fraction of adoption a month later or a year later. If we go for, and those might be different things, a month later, a year later. If you go for 2 individuals that's sort of more on the periphery, but maybe connected, the green individuals, you would see a different outcome. And so here's where there's a lot of sort of applied sociology that's been theorized about to try and sort of develop strategies for these interventions. And the really exciting thing is that it's only in the last 5 years that people are doing large-scale field experiments across populations of networks, in this case populations of villages, to try and answer these questions and sort of really evaluate what these interventions look like. And that's where I've stepped in, because it's actually this quite complicated mathematical evaluation process of sort of evaluating the efficacy and putting error bars on complex quantities. So just to give you a sense that this isn't just a one-off sort of one village in Honduras type of scenario, here's 3 recent examples of field experiments of this variety, where different questions are being asked about sort of how to move the needle at a network level based on interventions at an individual level. So we have this scenario of sort of 32 villages in Honduras where we're trying, the stated goal was to try and increase the adoption of water purification tablets or multivitamins. There are actually 2 different interventions. You can see one of those villages up here where the green nodes are water purification, the red nodes are multivitamins, and the blue nodes are nodes that got both. And they're actually running 2 interventions at the same time on a given network. In parallel, there's been this other work on trying to get farmers to adopt weather insurance. So there's lots of interesting speculation about sort of social risk management, where one of the theories of sort of trying to increase the adoption or sort of the purchasing of insurance products is that bad events, whether they be health insurance crises or weather crises, tend to drain the sort of not the social capital, but the capital available to individuals within their social network. And so if you can introduce better insurance products into a village, you might actually very subtly move the needle on the whole village's sort of economic health. So this is a question that's much more nebulous in the sense that the first problem, it was just like, how many people did we give water purification tablets? How many people are using them 3 months later? Whereas here we're asking this question that's like, we get 4 people to adopt weather insurance, and we're actually trying to understand like what is the available credit in the village a year later or many years later. That's a hard thing to measure. For the purposes of the direct study here, we're just looking at how many households did end up sort of also adopting weather insurance. So those are kind of rather classic marketing problems. The third example, which has the same setup but is subtly different, comes actually from straight out of sociology. So Betsy Levy-Pollack at Princeton, who deserves a gold star for helping us jump through amazing hoops to share this data, because it's sort of adolescent data, lots of complicated IRB. So she's been doing a lot of field work in the developing economy of New Jersey, where the question is really about evaluating anti-bullying programs. So you go into a school and you want to put 8 students or 16 students in a room, and you want to see, you give them some multi-hour training on sort of why bullying is bad and different strategies for addressing bullying in your school, in your community. And the question is then sort of how much does this move the needle on these peer conflict events, sort of this records question at the school level at the end of the school year. And what's slightly different about this setup as opposed to the previous two is that in the previous two, if you had enough money, you would sort of give the water purification tablet to everybody. If you had enough time, you would go around and train everybody, sort of provide information to everybody about the farmer's weather insurance. Here, there's something else going on where it's a group level treatment. So you're selecting sort of 8, 16 individuals, and you're putting them in a room together, and it's quite clear that you wouldn't get the same effect of putting the entire class in the room. You know, you would lose focus. Individuals would sort of say, oh, well, you know, they would not have skin in the game, et cetera. So, but if you make this a small enough intervention, you actually get through to them, and then you're hoping that there are social spillovers. So it's just sort of giving you a sense that there's a bunch of different contexts like this across domains that are currently where very ambitious field experiments are being run. So to be clear, this type of a field experiment involves, you know, driving up into 150 villages one by one, doing a complete social network survey of all the individuals in the village, asking them who knows who, and now you've got the starting point of then running your intervention. Right? So it's sort of this incredibly laborious task to try and evaluate these different strategies. And the goal is actually that something that I'm going to talk about is that the hope is that we're going to learn things such that at a later stage we can shift from explore to exploit and say, okay, we learned something, and actually the next time around we don't need to map out the social networks. We can just use some strategies that are very lightweight that are going to make it possible to sort of expect to see a higher intervention if sort of generalizability holds, sort of to expect to see high adoption without having to do that incredibly arduous task. So this is sort of like doing the research groundwork of going to all those villages. So the high watermark for sort of number of schools or number of villages marked is actually the following study, which has the question mark title. So can network-based targeting increase technology adoption? There's this joke that when the title is a question, the answer is no. So basically, you know, if the answer was yes, they would have said so in the title. They have very ambiguous results from their evaluation. So they went into 200 villages in Malawi. They were doing a training program related to agricultural interventions. And they had 50 villages in each of 4 treatments where they were trying 4 different strategies. And it's actually like a wash in their findings. And part of why I became interested in this is that there are these huge data sets that are messy and complicated. And basically, it's a wash because there's very large error bars. And we've been trying to develop new statistics to confidently, sort of incredibly make subtle assumptions that give us smaller error bars without going too deeply into the details. So let's talk about sort of some related work, just to sort of put this also on the radar. So I mentioned that this is a classic problem for marketing. There's actually sort of a well-studied optimization problem that's related to this marketing problem, which is what's called influence maximization. So this is every marketer's dream of solving the following problem. You give them a social network and you say, I want to target K people. Who should I target? You know, so I want to target 10 people in this town in Nebraska or whatever, and then I want hush puppies to let 1,000 suns bloom, sort of the Malcolm Gladwell narrative of tipping points, and achieve all the things, all your dreams as a marketer. And so the optimization community and sort of computer science community has been studying this problem and quickly realized when it was sort of put to somebody that, hey, this is NP hard. This is sort of computationally a very difficult problem to try and optimize the objective of maximizing the expected number of people who adopt a product. But the good news is that there's sort of good approximation algorithms. And computer science has this formal language for approximation algorithms. So these approximation algorithms get within a guaranteed factor of the optimum. But so that's sort of, it was this very productive run of the early 2000s. But the thing about influence maximization is that it's all based on a model of behavior. And that's where we don't really have good models, and we haven't been able to test those models very well. And there's, just to sort of give you a flavor, there's two main models that people study. One is called the independent cascade model. I don't want to overwhelm you with proper nouns, but so we have the independent cascade model, and there's something else called the linear threshold model. And if you take a given graph, so you're given this social network of one of these village networks, and if you, under one model, it would say, oh, you should go for A, B, and C. Under a different model, it says go for D, E, and F. Because basically, the different model, in one case, you're assuming people act independently. In another case, you're assuming there's some sort of critical threshold phenomenon that people need to cross. And based on how people are behaving, different strategies are sort of optimal. So there's this large literature of sort of, you hand a mathematician your graph and a model, and they tell you the following three seeds. But then they also sort of say, they clarify and say, actually, if this other model is true, you should select somebody completely different. And you have no real way of knowing which of these models is true. So while that's a well-studied problem, there's been a large gap to empirical applied work with this question, which is really asking sort of, you can design clever targeting algorithms for a given model, but then what really happens in the real world? Sort of, we don't know which of these models is actually playing out. And so with this work that I've been doing and sort of leveraging this recent large empirical, why now? Like all of a sudden, just very recently do we have these large data sets, is asking these questions of, without a model, can we empirically evaluate what happens? And the funny thing is when you look at these data of like who adopts, without going into too much detail, the models say things are going to spread like a tree. And you look at who adopts compared to the actual underlying social network you've collected, and there are things that are impossible under the model in the data, right? So you see people who adopted who there's no path from the people you gave it to them in the network. So you actually can't even fit the model to the data because the model just balks and says, no, that could never happen. So clearly there are things going on that are kind of outside what the models are capturing, and so that's where it's extremely valuable that people have been collecting these hundreds of villages, parallel instances of networks data to try and evaluate, when is the outcome going high and when is the outcome going low. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about basically the strategy space of how to target individuals. And I don't want to disappoint you, but it turns out that the vast majority of targeting is actually random targeting. Sort of you just go in and you select a random sample. And what we're going to see is that's actually not a bad idea. And the reason that's not a bad idea, just to preview a little bit of what we've been seeing when we've been evaluating these data sets, is that a random sample does a really good job of spreading out who you're targeting. So I'm not going to rely on models, but a model-based intuition is that you're sort of, if you do a good job of spreading out, you're able to create adoption sort of all over this village in Honduras or this school in New Jersey. You reach all the different social cliques. Whereas whereas there are a bunch of clever ideas, and empirically we've been seeing that those clever ideas don't really seem to work. But for the fun of it, let's talk about what those clever ideas are. Or not just for the fun of it. They sound like really good ideas, and it's been sort of this disappointment to me as somebody who likes to study social networks and think about these clever ideas to see on which side of the aisle these outcomes have landed. So the main clever idea that's been deployed in a number of these field experiments is this idea of exploiting what's called the friendship paradox. So I'll describe the strategy first, then I'll describe what the friendship paradox is. But the strategy is you rock up into the village and you say, can you refer me to a random friend? And then that's the person you give the intervention to. Okay, so you take a random person, you pick a random friend, and that's who you give the product to. And the idea, this goes back to this friendship paradox idea due to Feld in 1991, though it can be argued to have been a known property of graphs before then. But as a basic property of not just social networks, but all networks, when you select a random starting point and travel along an edge, you're basically selecting destinations based on how many paths they have to reach them. So when you do that hop, you're more likely to land at somewhere that is sort of the destination of a lot of edges, and you're less likely to land at somebody who doesn't have that many friends. That's sometimes easier to think about. Sort of if you do this trick, you're very unlikely to land at somebody who has very few friends. And so the catchphrase with the friendship paradox is your friends have more friends than you. Okay? So we should all feel bad about that. And so there's other targeting strategies that you can think about, but this has been sort of the main horse in the race that everybody has had lots of causes for optimism based on theoretical arguments for this being a good idea. And this is where the Honduras project is something that the Gates Foundation has funded at the level of sort of $5 million to do it actually now at the scale of 200 villages. There's lots of research being thrown at trying to establish that the friendship paradox gives us better, higher impact interventions. Bad news coming. There's also this note for those of you who sort of are in the statistics community. So we're actually going to be using something called off-policy evaluation, where it turns out that there's another clever trick going on here where because the data was collected with random sampling, random seed individuals, we can actually learn things about other stochastic policies, other randomized policies, because the fact that it was selected uniformly at random, sometimes the villages we select, or sometimes the individuals we select, sort of could have also happened under other strategies, and we can do some clever probability reweighting. So let's talk about the friendship paradox. So Steve Strogatz, who's an applied mathematician at Cornell, has this fun write-up on the friendship paradox in the New York Times from a few years ago. This was actually, I was having a conversation with him. I take credit for this. I was having a conversation with him, and I said, you know what's really hard to explain to people? The friendship paradox. And Steve, who's sort of this very sort of pedagogy of mathematics individual, has sort of said, challenge accepted. So he was at the time writing this New York Times column about sort of tricky math problems. And so informally, it's this idea that your friends have more friends than you. And slightly more formally, it's this idea that a random friend has more friends than a random person. And this is actually not a social phenomenon. It's a mathematical phenomenon. And it's based on the fact that the only thing you need for this to be true, it's nothing about people. The only thing you need for this to be true in a graph is that there's some amount of variation in how many friends people have. If there's no variation, going to a friend, you're not going to change up where you're standing, right? So if everybody has exactly 5 friends, you're going to start at somebody who has 5 friends, and you're going to hop to somebody who has 5 friends. But if there's variation, then this sort of phenomenon is true in expectation that you're going to go up. You're expecting to go up in how connected the individual you land at is. So hopping to a random friend is going to reach people who are more connected. And that seems like a good thing. The other thing I'll say about this one-hop strategy is that it doesn't require knowledge of the network. Right? All you did was walk up, you picked a random person, and you passed the message along. And so you didn't have to, it's something that we can do without collecting the whole network, handing it to an optimizer, having them run influence maximization, and having them tell us 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 is who you should target. So that's sort of one of the really interesting promises of this idea. So friendship paradox, it dates back to the 90s. I've done some prior work, or sort of some work a number of years ago at this point, together with people on the then data team, now core data science at Facebook, which was about asking sort of to what extent is this true in large-scale social networks. I just wanted to share this. It's not just, this was a figure that Steve's daughter drew and published in the New York Times. He wanted his daughter to be published in the New York Times. So he had his daughters draw their friends, Becca, Abby, Chloe, and it was sort of an illustrative example. It's cute. But it's true here, because basically what's happening here is that Becca is this individual who has 3 friends. And if you pick a person and then take a random hop, you're very likely to land at Becca. And so like this random friend is like a lot of paths lead to Becca. And so, but whereas very few paths sort of lead to Abby. Sort of to get to Abby, you have to start at Becca and have Becca nominate Abby. And so that's this thing that you're more likely to land at individuals who are more connected. At scale, sort of if you look at, depending on if you have 200 friends on Facebook, this is 2011 numbers. Nowadays, people have even more friends on Facebook. So if you had 200 friends on Facebook, the average number of friends among your friends was 400. If you had 400 friends, it was 600, 600, it was 700, et cetera. They just sort of stay ahead of you. In order to be kind of above average or sort of above your friends' average, the breaking point is all the way out at having sort of 800 friends. Only those individuals, on average, have more friends. This is more of an empirical breakdown. The mathematical statement behind friendship paradox is something that's true on average for everybody. But if you break it down based on how connected you are, the vast majority of people, and most people have far less than 800 friends in this data set, are sort of less connected than their friends. You have to be pretty darn cool to be cooler than the average of your friends. Sorry. The other thing here that's going on is that the dotted line is sort of this, if you pick a random person, you pick a random individual, you're expected to land at somebody who has about 600 friends, which is significantly higher than in this data set, the average friend count was 200. So you're really like super boosting up from an average person who has 200 friends to an average person who has 600 friends when you do this strategy. So it sounds great. I can't resist giving this corollary. So your friends have more friends than you. On Facebook, it's also true that your friends log in more than you. And basically, anything that correlates with how many friends you have is also going to have this property of your friends exceeding you. Right? So people who have a lot of friends log in a lot. And so your friends have more friends than you. Correlation, your friends log in more than you. So whenever you're logging into Facebook, unless you're one of these, so the x-axis here is how many days out of a 4-week period that you log in. And the y-axis is how many days out of a 4-week period your friends log in. So if you're somebody who logs in sort of, a few days a month, your friends are logging in 20 days a month. If you're somebody, it's only once you're a sort of a more than 3 out of every 4 days in a month type of person that you're close to or exceeding how your friends are, how often your friends are logging in. So this also sort of is related to a bunch of, this has been connected to a bunch of psychological phenomena about sort of like, are you feeling bad because your friends are producing more content than you? Well, that's sort of always going to be true according to these things that channel through the friendship paradox. So there's a whole layer of sort of second order, what are called generalized friendship paradoxes of things that are correlated with how many friends you have that make for sort of make the world complicated. But for us, complicated is good. We're going to exploit this now to try and move the needle on multivitamin interventions, water purification interventions, et cetera. So our two horses in the race are going to be random sampling and then this one-hop targeting, which is using the friendship paradox. So let's see what happens when you do the friendship paradox-based sampling on these villages. Well, this is not a super high-power projector, I guess, but basically, if you look in this is the histogram of all the different ways you could select 2 nodes. And that red node has a much higher probability than for the red set has a much higher probability than the green set under friendship paradox targeting. So we're more likely to reach these sets of people who are central to the network. Sounds good. I'm really building this up. So let's go to this Honduras dataset. Water purification, multivitamins, 32 villages. They actually did 9 villages, 9 villages, 9 villages, 3 different strategies. There were sort of a few backup villages in case they lost data and things like that. It's crazy when you run experiments and there's like backup villages in your data set. So in 9 of the villages, they were doing random targeting. 9 of the villages, they were doing this sort of friendship paradox targeting. And 9 of the villages, they were doing something where they were just going for the person who had the max degree. So remember that max degree targeting requires you to do that whole social network survey. So it's not something that you're going to keep on doing, but they wanted to see sort of like how well does it do compared to something like max degree targeting. And then they were using, sort of getting into the statistics, they were using difference of means estimators to compare 9 versus 9. So even though there's tens of thousands of individuals across these villages, you're actually sitting on a sample size of like a 9 versus 9 test, which is really depressing. It's like you did all this work and it's equivalent to a medical trial where you had 18 people signed up. So it's like, it's scary to put error bars on these types of quantities. And basically, that's where we, together with my colleagues, I've been developing these sort of advanced estimators, basically, for the same estimands, and trying to make mild assumptions that are reasonable that get us much higher confidence of sort of what the differences between these effects are. So I'm going to start actually with this Tsai et al. Data, sort of this China farmers insurance product. And so the question is sort of, so seeds are given insurance products, or are introduced to an insurance product. And the question is, what fraction of the village signs up for insurance? I think it's 3 months later. And is one-hop targeting or random targeting going to do better? And here's this sort of table-style result. So the estimate of the difference is that one-hop targeting is worse than random targeting in terms of the percentage of, there's 4% fewer participants per village that adopt when you do friendship paradox targeting compared to random targeting. Science is science. Our p-values are sort of right on the boundary of significant. That wasn't the point. We're not trying to sort of celebrate 0.05 or not. My main takeaway from this is that it's sort of a wash. Like, we did not see positive effect. And the big difference between our analysis and the previous analysis is that I keep thinking one of these clickers is the other. Laser, there we go. That we're putting confidence intervals where we're actually able to not reject 0 in the opposite direction of what we thought we were going to reject it. So it turns out that the Hayek estimator, which is something we're using, one-hop targeting would lead to less adoption than random targeting if they had used one-hop targeting. We go into these New Jersey schools, and we see that if they did random targeting, if they had done friendship paradox targeting to try and seed the anti-bullying intervention with individuals who are very well connected, they would have actually, it would have led to more conflict. They got more conflict reduction, according to our estimates, from random targeting than they would have if they had done friendship paradox targeting. So why? In a lot of ways, this is sort of like the best outcome for somebody like me. It's like, now we get to theorize. Sort of like why, we get to revisit theories and try and understand what's going on. The first argument is the argument that I advanced earlier, which is this idea that random targeting is a pretty worthy adversary. It's a pretty good baseline because it reaches all the parts of the network. And for certain types of networks that we're still trying to understand if real-world networks in these settings are like this. For certain types of networks, as you select a random sample and you start walking to more connected individuals, you end up walking towards the core of the graph, and you lose track of sort of these random seeds that you had in the periphery. So actually, you end up concentrating the region of the network that you seed in, and so you actually end up doing worse for that reason. And we're working on sort of making statements about that rigorous. Here's something else that's more speculation, which is that the friendship paradox requires variation in how many friends you have. If everybody's only really caring about sort of like 3 strong friends, then you're actually in this regime where things are pretty balanced, and you're not going to go up in connectivity by doing this one-hop trick. So that's a theory that's consistent with a no effect. It doesn't explain why we're seeing a negative effect. So we're trying to sort of put that together. There's clever things you can do if this is your specific question. You shouldn't actually, if this was the research question you're interested in, you're going into 100 villages, you shouldn't go in and do sort of flip a coin and do strategy 1 or strategy 2. You can do, the most intuitive explanation for why you shouldn't do that is that if there's a set of people, sort of 5 individuals that are equally likely under both strategies, finding out what the outcome is under those strategies doesn't tell you anything about the difference. So what you want to do is you want to focus on seed sets that are likely under one and unlikely under the other. Likely under the other and unlikely under one. And those are the ones that are going to inform your estimators. So there's a whole sort of optimal design argument here where you seed sets that have equal probability under the 2 strategies provide no information. So without going into too much detail, the number of villages that they're collecting data about and the estimators they're using, it feels like they have a population of 150, a population of 56. And with our estimators, we're superpowering that to make it, we're providing estimators that compared to the basic estimator, the effective sample size is sort of up to 800 villages. So in order to get the error bars that they're getting, the error bars we're getting with their estimators, they would need to go out and sample 800 villages instead of 100 villages. So there's it's a real win for sort of doing more advanced statistics. So in summary, interventions targeting these types of communities, they very often have non-trivial network effects. It's not just about sort of targeting 3 individuals and seeing if they adopt it. There's all these spillover effects. But to leverage those network effects, we need to understand them first. And these modeling assumptions about is it threshold, is it independent, we need to anchor that in an empirical reality. This friendship paradox idea, which is sort of great idea, beautiful homework exercise to undergraduates at Stanford, doesn't appear to be working, and I'm super interested in understanding why. We don't know. As a collective research community, we don't know. And then there's a sort of surprising thing that actually, from the 2 studies that we've done these reanalyses on, it actually sort of points to a negative result. So there's a paper on this if you're interested in sort of the statistical methodologies that we've been developing that also brings together a lot of this research on sort of network level interventions that's been going on across many communities, that sort of the introduction sets all that up and then it goes off the deep end in terms of stats. So thank you so much.